Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session of the Conversations on South Asia series. The Conversations series is hosted by faculty in the South Asian Studies Collective here at Dartmouth, each of whom select books published during the past 2 years for us to discuss and reflect on, not only as a Dartmouth audience, but as a wider public audience. My name is Kirk Gambetta. I'm the faculty coordinator for this year's Conversation series, as well as a postdoctoral fellow in the Society Fellows and a lecturer in art history here at Dartmouth. So, without further ado, we in the South Asian Studies Collective are very excited today to be hosting a conversation about Srirupa Roy's new book, The Political Outsider: Indian Democracy and the Lineages of Populism, published in 2024 by Stanford University Press. So, following introductions by Dartmouth professor Smriti Upadhyay, Srirupa Roy will begin by presenting her book, after which Ruchi Chaturvedi and Kanchan Chandra will provide their responses. So before proceeding with today's book conversation, I want to make a few announcements and acknowledgements. First of all, I want to make everyone aware of two upcoming conversation series events during the spring quarter. On April 10th at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be hosting a conversation about Nesarge Davi's new book, Indifference, on the Praxis of Interspecies Being. Our final event of the year will take place on May 15th and will feature Akriti Mandwani's book, Everyday Reading, Middlebrow Magazines and Book Publishing in Post-Independence India. Again, that will be on Thursday, May 15th at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So do look for sign-up information in our email correspondence, website, and social media accounts for events coming up in the spring quarter. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this event, the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages, and the Bodas Fund for South Asian Programming at Dartmouth. I'd also like to thank our two Bodas student fellows, Navya Bharadwaj and Mritula Saravanan, for helping organize today's conversation. We really couldn't do this without them. And lastly, I'd like to thank Hope Rennie and the Department of Asian Societies, Cultures, and Languages for all of her help with the series. And one overall reminder to webinar attendees, please leave your comments in the Q&A box, not the chat. We will have time after the three presentations to address your questions and comments. I'd like to now introduce Professor Smriti Upadhyay, our moderator for today's conversation. Smriti is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at Dartmouth. She is currently working on a book project that looks at labor and class politics in the Hindu nationalist movement in India. With that, I'll now ask Smriti to introduce today's speaker and respondents. Thank you, Smriti.
Thanks, Kurt. Welcome to our distinguished panelists. I am really excited for the conversation, and I've been thinking that it's so relevant in the various places that we're all places and positions that we're all sitting in and thinking from. So. Our author, Srirupa Roy, is a professor and chair of State and Democracy at the Center for Modern Indian Studies at the University of Göttingen, and a founding director of the Marian Tagore International Center for Advanced Studies, Metamorphosis of the Political. Her books include the book that we're going to be discussing today, The Political Outsider: Indian Democracies and the Lineages of Populism, which came out with Stanford University Press in 2024, as well as Saffron Republic: Hindu Nationalism and State Power in India, edited with Thomas Hansen from Cambridge University Press in 2022. Visualizing Secularism and Religion in Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, and India, edited with Aliv Chinar and Maha Yahya with University of Michigan Press 2012. Beyond Belief, India and the Politics of Postcolonial Nationalism, which was published with Duke in 2007, and Violence and Democracy in India, edited with Amrita Basu, is published by Siegel Books in 2006. Her current research is on the resurgence of civilizational discourses in India and other parts of the world, undertaken in collaboration with members of the Civilizationalism Project, an international network she co-convenes with Thomas Hansen. Welcome, and welcome back to Dartmouth, Srirupa. We have Dr. Ruchi Chaturvedi with us as well. She is a political and legal anthropologist at the University of Cape Town. Dr. Chaturvedi's work looks at cultures of democracy, popular politics, and political violence in post-colonial democracies. Her research has examined the formation of antagonistic political communities and the emergence of violent majoritarianism in India. She is the author of Violence of Democracy, Inter-Party Conflict in South India, which was published by Duke University Press in 2023. Her new project compares histories of nationalism and majoritarian formations in South Asia and South Africa, attending particularly to women's diverse experiences of violent transitions from coloniality to post-colonial rule. She's also the co-editor of Epistemic Justice and the Post-Colonial University, which was published by Wits University Press in 2023. Welcome, Dr. Chaturvedi. And last but not least, we have Kanchan Chandra, who is a professor of politics at New York University, NYU. She works on questions of ethnicity, democracy, violence, patronage, and clientelism, party politics, and the politics of South Asia. She's the lead author of Democratic Dynasties, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2016. Constructivist Theories of Ethnic Politics, which was published with Oxford University Press in 2012, and Why Ethnic Parties Succeed, Patronage and Ethnic Headcounts in India, which was published with Cambridge University Press in 2004. In addition to these books, Dr. Chandra has published a number of articles in several leading journals. She's currently working on two large-scale research projects. The first is it theorizes the effect of ethnic mobilization on democratic stability and governance from a constructivist perspective, and the second looks at democratic transformations in South Asia. So thank you so much, and without further ado, I'll pass it to Dr. Roy to talk to us about her book, and I will set the timer for 12 minutes.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kurt and Smriti and others at Dartmouth who've made this possible, and especially want to thank Kanchan and Ruchi for wading through this book and being so gracious and agreeing to do this. I am especially thrilled to be able to present this book at Dartmouth because, I mean, quite literally, the first thing I ever wrote about Indian politics was at and because of Dartmouth. So it's wonderful to come speak to this audience in your series. So thank you for that. What I'll do today is I'll try to talk to you a little bit about where this book came from. So the motivations and rationale of the book, and then I'll summarize in very broad brush strokes the arguments, and then we can kind of take it from there. So in terms of where this book came from, the initial question that I began with in the early millennium was this question of the new politics of New India, right? So I was broadly interested in the question of the relationship between economic reform and democratic change. This was my entry point. There was a wide literature on neoliberal democracy, on how kind of economic reforms had transformed democratic practice and political culture. And, most of this literature was based in and on European examples. And so there was a lot, and US, and there was a lot of discussion about the rise of market rationalities, individualized entrepreneurial cultures, the retreating role of the state. I mean, all of this we know in terms of the discussion of neoliberalism. So I was interested in how all of this played out in India, where, of course, we know economic reform had a distinct trajectory, and democracy from the get-go had been configured in quite distinctive ways. So what was being transformed was also going to be quite different. So this is the question I kind of entered the kind of research arena with. And what I was particularly interested in was this, what at the time, this is around 2006, 2008, there was this distinctive new political logic of an angry anti-politics of the people, right? So whether you want to gloss this in terms of the politics of the new middle classes or in other ways, this was really, what was on the table at the time. And in some ways, this really converged with a lot of global political trends. So if we throw our thoughts back to the 2010s, this was the time of an angry populism in many different parts of the world, right? Whether we're talking about an Occupy Wall Street or a Arab Spring movement, the Indignados in Spain, etc. What you have is really these public assemblies of angry citizens rising up against corrupt and unaccountable elites and undemocratic regimes around the world. And you see a version of that in India at this time. And this is in a sense where I began of thinking about populism as a democratic upsurge on the part of ordinary citizens, right? People on the streets demanding change. And in a sense, populist politics at this moment seemed to be across the globe something that would strengthen or was strengthening and improving democracy. But if you fast forward in just a few years, by the time we get to 2015, certainly, politics in the name of the people is linked to a very different formation. Now, what you have is the rise of a strongman politics with a decidedly authoritarian bent in the name of people power. So the promise of people power by 2015 onwards is linked to the rise of figures like Modi, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Trump, etc. So really this dramatic shift in the normative meaning of the people from a politics of popular empowerment to that of authoritarianism is what I then started to think about. And in a sense, this question, the broader question of what might the relationship between populism and democracy be, became the question of the book. So it's really something that kind of evolved in part because, this book took a very long time to write. And in the process, in a sense, what I was looking at became this moving target that shifted in normative meaning, right? And I think so that's one of the benefits of, I suppose, slow writing and slow research. So, in terms of, in a sense, this relationship between populism and democracy, and I think this is, the two ways in which I've tried to approach this, and this is what runs through the book. So at one level, I'm interested in the relationship between populism and democracy in historical and material terms, which is quite simply the question of when and how does a populist politics emerge out of a political democracy, right? Populism, in most of the cases of populism that we see around the world, emerges out of a formally democratic political context. So in that sense, my first set of questions is about this historical relationship. When did populism emerge in India? When and how did it emerge out of Indian democracy? And then there's a second level of this question that I think I also, certainly I want to address, which is the political relationship of the two, which is this question of the democratic consequences of populist politics. What exactly is power to the people, the power to do? And what does this mean for democracy, right? I mean, it's interesting. We have a lot of literature on why people vote for populist parties, which is a very important question. And it's the question that's always on our mind. But thinking about the political character of populism, what kind of a politics is it? What does it mean for democracy? Is it always and only right wing, or can we have a left wing populism? These are the, register of debates that I also wanted to engage with. And so I would say those are the two sets of questions that run through the book at a certain level. And of course, the way I address it is through the specific example of populism in India. And these two ideas of curative democracy and outsider politics, the political outsider and curative democracy, that I argue are at the core, certainly of Indian populism, but we might say, populism in a broader context as well. Okay, so that's in a sense what the motivation of the book is, and just in case people are interested in the structure, which again is slightly peculiar in that it mirrors like I said, the long and also the rather zigzag research process that eventually produced the book. And so I chose to kind of structure the book to reflect how I arrived at the argument the way that I did. And so what I do, and I'll do, I begin with the present, and I begin by documenting millennial Indian populism, the kind of field that I initially went in to look at. And so I kind of talk about curative democracy and the political outsider as it appeared to me in the context of my research in, the early years of the 21st century, right? And I did this by looking primarily at two agents of this kind of new populist politics, which was the Aam Aadmi Party, the Ordinary Persons Party, known by its Hindi acronym AAP, which was a new political party at the time, and that had won elections in the state of Delhi and had this kind of very new and different political agenda. So that was one of the things I looked at. And then the other, which was again a key actor in this new populist political field, which was television news media. And I looked specifically at, and I'll be happy to talk about this in the discussion, but I was interested in looking at news media and journalists as political actors, as opposed to just thinking about media as in textual terms, just in terms of message and agenda setting. I was also interested in looking at the actual institutional effects and political engagements and intervention of media as, as I said, as an actor in this political field. So the first part of the book kind of starts with the present and tells you about these concepts in the present. I then move in the second part of the book to the historical question: where does this all come from? Where did the political outsider and this idea of curative democracy that I'll explain, where did this all come from? And I take you to the 1970s, what I call the long 1970s, and I kind of talk about what it means to locate the origins or the backstory of Indian populism in this particular emergency and post-emergency period. And then I finally end the book by zigzagging back to the present and talking a little bit, speculating, I would say, a little bit about what these concepts might help to tell us about some of the kind of political questions of our times. And by that, I mean now in the in 2023, 2024, when I'm finishing the book, the question of the time is the, rise of authoritarian populism, the Hindutva project in India. So does this kind of discussion of populism and the 1970s, what light, if any, does it throw on this present? So that's the structure. And then very briefly and schematically, the main arguments that I make. So first, in relation to this idea of the curative democracy and the political outsider, I basically argue that populism is a form of politics that promises that a political outsider, someone who's disconnected from politics and power, electoral politics in particular, will cure or fix the broken and diseased democratic system. So there's this idea, the kind of populist story is a story of curing democracy through the interventions and engagements of people who are located outside politics. And the kind of practical and institutional aspect of this is that what we're seeing in this period, and actually from the 70s onwards, is the rising influence of non-electoral authority of various kinds in India. Curative democracy, the political outsider, and the politics of populism, more broadly speaking, have consolidated a beyond the ballot form of politics and have normalized this idea of extra electoral authority, right? So we're used to, of course, thinking about, India's kind of electoral polity, electorally constituted, and, the kind of the core element that elections play. But there's also this aspect of non-electoral authority. So that's kind of, where curative democracy and the political outsider leads us to. And then just very briefly, the implications of all of this for democracy, I talk about how this type of a politics is, essentially I describe it as a top-down politics. I talk about how this call for power to the people essentially involves power scrutiny more than power sharing. I talk about the counter-democratic implications of extra-electoral political authority and the ways in which it is problematic for democracy. And I also then talk about this idea of the political outsider in some detail, and how a political outsider, or the figures that end up making these claims to being outsiders, are invariably social insiders of some kind. And I'll be happy to expand on this aspect of, the kind of, so if we look at the sociology of the Indian news media, if we look at the kind of sociology of the Aam Aadmi Party, and especially if we ask about questions of caste and class and their intersections, then we get to a very different story about who the outsider is, and where this kind of politics is socially located. And I'll kind of maybe just end with this. The second part of the book then takes us, as I said, to the long 1970s, and says that, all of this particular type of a politics does not, I mean, even though I began with thinking that this is a kind of post-reform politics, right? That was my framework. This is this kind of millennial populism that's all about, the changes that have been ushered in as a result of economic liberalization. But my research led me in various ways to actually this period of the emergency and the post-emergency as the place where the historical place where these ideas of extra electoral authority, of morality versus politics, and this particular idea of the people needing representation beyond the ballot box, accompanied, of course, by a particular kind of distaste for electoral politics that emerges in this era of the emergency and the post-emergency. And maybe in the I'll kind of stop with this. In the discussion section, I'll be happy to elaborate more on why it's interesting and important to think about this being the genealogy of populism, and what it means to bring this emergency and post-emergency moment into our discussion of Indian democracy. We're used to thinking about our turning points of Indian democracy as 1947 and then maybe 1991, which is economic reform. But I think this period of the 70s is an interesting moment to consider as well. So maybe I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's given us already a lot to think about. And I'll just take, before I pass it to Ruchi. Before I pass it to Ruchi, I'll just remind our audience, please post your questions in the Q&A and not the chat. And once we've heard from our two discussants, we'll turn to your questions. So we look forward to seeing those. Thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi.
Thanks a lot, Smriti, and Kurt, and of course Srirupa, for inviting me to speak on Srirupa's book. So I won't I'll just go right into it. My comments are going to be a lot less, maybe perhaps around the question of populism, but more around the question of the curative. And I'll explain how I found myself really thinking about this, especially in relationship to Aam Aadmi Party and the Hindu right, but also drawing connections with South Africa, where I'm based in Cape Town. So if I'm not mistaken, Srirupa's initial disciplinary training was in comparative politics. You can correct me, Srirupa, if I'm wrong, but that's how I remember your biography, your intellectual biography. For some time now, a number of us who study South Asian politics, political sociologists, political anthropologists, political theorists, have been taking our cues from previous generation of critical scholars and calling for making the study of South Asia more comparative, while also redefining what comparison means. Comparison for a whole generation of us, for us, or the whole generation of us, I believe, does not, dare I say, absolutely does not mean treating so-called older democracies as the normative desirable model, and seeing how newer democracies in post-colonial Asia, Africa, or Latin America measure up to the norm. Instead, comparison means attending to the details of political life in these spaces and drawing on that analysis to understand and grapple with what is happening, not just in our own backyards, but most of the world. The need for such a comparative method feels more urgent than ever when the dominant model of representative democracy has bequeathed to us figures such as Donald Trump, Modi, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, that Srirupa invoked and whom she calls a few strong men. And here I am, like I said, using the vocabulary that Srirupa's book offers us. So these few strong men promise to cure the ills of our respective polities. The book's penultimate chapter embodies that comparative method in incisive ways. Here, Srirupa offers what we might call typologies of outsider curative figures and unpacks dispositions and discourses that accompany the rise of strong men who have championed an exclusionary and authoritarian democracy, even as they have promised to cure it of its various malices. Their elective despotism, and I'm quoting Srirupa here, and I found this phrase really very evocative, offers what she calls structural recalibration of contemporary disorder around the promise of redemptive action. Srirupa, and I'm in complete agreement here, refuses to exceptionalize this despotism. She regards the emergence of figures such as Trump, Modi, or Bolsonaro, with all their spectacular excesses and mediatized, ever-proliferating presence, as notable signals of something that has been unfolding in democracies for a long time. And she sort of laid out that genealogy for us here today as well. Of course, specific conjunctures play a very crucial role in the emergence of an elective despot in one place or another. But if I understand you correctly, Srirupa, you're suggesting that there is something about the contemporary political condition, or what might be called the post-colonial contemporary, that lends itself to the language of order and disorder, promise of redemption, and promise of redemption, and recalibrative actions from outside figures. So as a first question or request, if you will, I'm wondering if we can unpack and name this condition that large swaths of the world inhabit. It's important not to impose universalizing frames on most of the world, but it seems to me that there is a shared condition that we are dwelling in multiple parts of the world, that your book can help us think about together. Based as I am in South Africa and currently moving in between South Asian and Southern African studies, I found two key terms and concepts, namely of the outsider and curative democracy, very generative to think with. And I found them generative because they help me think about the two places together, to put them in a comparative frame, if you will, to ask broader questions about the post-colonial contemporary, and indeed try to do what I'm also requesting Srirupa to do for us a little bit, which is unpack these aspects of this shared condition. Hence, in the rest of my comments, I will invoke South Africa, even as I talk about political life in India, which is at the heart of Srirupa's book, and I might also try to scale up from them. But let me start with India and a point that Srirupa makes towards the end of the book that I believe is very valuable. On page 258, Srirupa reminds us that an exclusive focus on Hindutva as religious identitarian formation remains limited. It is not sufficient for us to understand its rise and the rise of strongmen with it. Instead, as Srirupa notes, Hindutva is a governmental project. In fact, it has been a biopolitical and governmental project for a very long time. Its vast network of welfare seva-oriented units that disperse health, food, educational, and livelihood assistance, and the works of scholars like Malini Bhattacharjee and Tariq Kachil, who have studied the relationship between the Sang's welfare-based strategies and electoral fortunes, come to mind. Rendering services, making them accessible, and rendering life livable grounds the curative claims of the Hindu right, as well as formations like Aam Aadmi Party. Each one in its own way, as Srirupa points out, is following in the footsteps of Indira Gandhi, who positioned herself as the messiah of the poor at various points in her own career. Where the genealogy of the son's welfare approach is concerned, one might have to stretch the genealogy even further back and think about the ways in which the figure of the outsider, plus rendering services, plus curing the pure quality of all its ills, comes together even in the earliest iterations of the Hindu right organizations, as well as in the form of a Sarvarkar or a Godse. I mean, Godse sort of killing Gandhi to almost save India from a figure like Gandhi and the kind of politics he thought he was doing. In my own work, I've mobilized the Foucauldian category of pastoral power to unpack the emergence of strong men, not only on the right, but also the left in North Kerala. Some of these strong men also mobilized various forms of coercion and violence, together with a welfare approach meant to relieve ordinary people of their hardships, much like the despots of today do. In black townships of late apartheid South Africa, whose history I'm currently studying, quasi-judicial structures led by petty bourgeois big men often facilitated access to necessities like land, food, water, shelter, and sanitation, help contain crime, manage interpersonal disputes, and maintain boundaries. In an authoritarian mold, they purged communities of opposition. They also collected taxes, rents, and service fees to sustain these operations. They often extorted protection money, ran illicit goods, and conducted heists. In today's South Africa, some of these people and their descendants have become important political figures who traverse the inside-outside of politics and take on very violent authoritarian forms while constantly speaking a certain kind of curative language that Srirupa invokes or has pointed us to. So this conjunction between pastoral power and sovereign violence, looking after ordinary people, helping and assisting them together with while asserting various forms of symbolic power and physical force, seems to be a widely prevalent aspect of modern political life in multiple places, one that the age of biopower and sovereign force have bequeathed to us. Does this plotting of the relationship between curative democracy, bio, and sovereign power speak to the ways in which Srirupa herself has come to think of the concept of the curative and figure of the despotic outsider? That's sort of my first question for you, Srirupa. If so, it would be great to hear more about the ways in which Srirupa thinks about the relationship between these terms and the phenomena, the continuities as well as the discontinuities between them. Staying with South Africa, Sharad Chari's wonderful new book, Apartheid Remains, describes how the biopolitical has not only been the site of repressive big men, but also community activists, ground-up formations that have embodied not only the best traditions of struggling for life and making life in late apartheid and post-South Africa and post-apartheid South Africa, but also cultivated forms of sociality amongst themselves that fundamentally challenge the racial divisions that have been instituted in the country. The Black consciousness movement and figures like Steve Biko were central to the emergence of those inclusive socialities that transcended racialized distinctions and led to the formation of non-identitarian identities amongst people who were and continue to be engaged in biopolitical struggles for health, infrastructure, and well-being. Srirupa's very important chapter on Aam Aadmi Party and the ways in which it failed to cultivate, one might say even belied, a more egalitarian social, while striving for better infrastructure, health, and education for all, begs the question, what are the conditions in which a more egalitarian social is cultivated? How can striving for a better infrastructure of life, health, water, food, fixing potholes, mobile clinics, and schools go hand in hand with not overlooking difference, race, gender, class, caste, and religion, but working through it in ways that challenges and maybe even undoes those hierarchies? Will representative democracies only have space for small-scale experiments that strive to do both? Does the proclivity to majoritarianism, positing those who do not belong and always already stand outside the national community, built into modern representative democracies, preclude the scaling up of these experiments? What might we learn from anti-CAA and the farmers' protests that the book ends with? These are some questions that I came away with as I finished the book, and I hope that they can help us take the conversation about this very rigorous and thoughtful work forward. Thank you.
Perfect timing. Thank you. Thank you, Ruchi. Over to you, Kanchan.
Thank you. I'll just set my timer so that doesn't take too long. I want to thank, can you hear me?
Yeah.
You can hear me, great. I want to thank Kurt and Smriti and the South Asian Studies Collective at Dartmouth for the invitation to discuss Srirupa's book, and also, of course, Doug Haynes, who taught both Srirupa and me, and who's been such an important force in South Asia-related initiatives at Dartmouth. And most of all, I want to thank Srirupa for the book. It really was a pleasure to read, and it's a privilege to be able to discuss it. And I want to say something about Srirupa's body of work, and then, just sort of raise a set of questions about this particular book. So we were at Dartmouth around the same time. We were just a year or two apart, and we really, in a way, our careers have developed around the same time. And I think one thing that really stands out about Srirupa's work is the extreme originality of it. And here I'm thinking, starting with the first book on Beyond Belief and this most recent book. And it's work, it's also scholarship, which is hard to categorize in the best possible way. I think within political science, she is one of a handful of people who occupies her own niche, where the work sits in the intersection of political philosophy and intellectual history and comparative politics without being sort of fully immersed in any of these fields. So it's not entirely in the domain of political philosophy, because she's looking not just at ideas, but at the concrete processes and the political processes by which the ideas are produced and the way in which they are perceived. And it's not entirely intellectual history, because she's looking at contemporary politics. And she's looking, again, not just at text, but how these ideas are articulated in the domain of political performance and political spectacle and political action. And I think now, I sort of see over time, there are people whose work I think is very difficult to categorize, who it's just extremely rewarding to read. I mean, there's Partha Chatterjee, there's Benedict Anderson, there's James Scott, all products of particular disciplines who do not fit entirely within them. And I think Srirupa's work, sits in that tradition. She's very much her own person, and the books are very much they occupy, I think, a distinct space. And I just wanted to applaud and appreciate that. And therefore, also reading is a real pleasure, because there are surprises on every page. It's an original argument. You turn the pages and you stop every few pages to say, my God, I didn't think of that. And also, I should say, reading it, I think in the language, for me, reading this book, it was as much a sensory experience as an intellectual one. And so there's a rhythm in the language and a turn of phrase. For instance, the idea, one of the many sentences, that democracy, as you know, in this post-emergency world, it wasn't just a system of rights, but it became a system of wrongs. And it's such an evocative sentence, but also, what I enjoyed here and appreciated was the ideas, but also the language. And so with that as sort of a background, I think what I wanted to do is really just raise a set of questions about the book. And I may not, usually I sort of always take more than my stipulated time, but I think today I may not take as much time. I have some comments that I want to fold really into the questions. So the first question I want to raise is, so here it's the idea of curative democracy, the idea that the central idea of the book, that democracy has become portrayed, particularly in the post-emergency period, as a broken system, as a diseased system, therefore requiring a cure and a strong man or some sort of outsider who acts as doctor. And the first thing I wanted to ask is, to what extent is the emergency the generative event, or even a generative event? Did this idea of a rotten state that needs to be cured by the action of a pure public, did it not begin with colonialism and with Gandhi? And so that colonialism, the colonial state, could be sort of the prototypical idea of a rotten state that needed to be cured by the takeover of, by people. And here, Nehru was very much an insider when it came to the rhetoric of democracy and the institutions of democracy, the state and the bureaucracy and the party, particularly the Congress Party. But Gandhi was the quintessential outsider. And so, one way of looking at this is to say the 1970s were really generative. Another way of looking at this is to say the emergency was an episode in a history that started much earlier. And maybe what was generative is not a particular event, but a relationship that unfolded over since at least the beginning of the 20th century between the colonial state and a nationalist opposition led by Gandhi. So that's the first question, to what extent is the emergency the generative event? To what extent is it an episode in a longer history? And here, of course, you refer to this in the book, but I think it's not an accident that J.P. Narayan was sort of presented himself as a Gandhian and used sort of all of the movements that precede, not all, but the JP movement and the strikes that preceded the emergency were very much framed in the logic of sort of being a Gandhian outsider and therefore also being beyond the ballot to a very large extent. I mean, JP presented himself as not wanting to work through the electoral system, not himself occupying any political office, and he in fact floated the idea of a party-less democracy as well. So that's one question. A second question, what's interesting is the emergency is a very specific historical event specific to India. But the populism that the book describes is currently so widespread. And so the second question I wanted to raise is, what are the comparative implications of the argument? If the emergency is unique to India, but the comparison is widespread, but populism is widespread, does this mean we need to look for emergency-like explanations in other countries? So does this mean that, the same way that this book provides the backstory of populism, or one potential backstory of populism, and really normalizing populism, that this is not a sign of the breakdown of democracy, but of the unfolding of democracy that started at least with the emergency? Is the comparative implication then that we should be looking for similar backstories? But, I think there's a potential conflict between between the widespread nature of populism and the unique nature of the explanation, So for instance, if we do see such similar, there's something about, if we see populism across the board in such distinct democracies, that have unfolded in such distinct ways, does that then lend support to a historical explanation rooted in the emergency, or does it suggest that there's some other path? I think the third, and it also may be that there are many paths to populism, and I think the book would have a friendly relationship with that. I don't think the book is asserting a unique path in any way. I think it's asserting continuities, but maybe there are many paths to the same outcome, and what we see in India is one particular path. The third question is, to what extent, and I think this riffs off something that Ruchi said, but maybe in a slightly different way, to what extent is this idea of a curative democracy tied to the global South? And so, there is a way, it is interesting, where long before, populism became sort of a category of analysis for democratic politics in general, or India, there was the category of the young democracy, the not quite democracy, the electoral democracy. And in political science, there's a whole cottage industry around this. And the idea is that you have the West is the cradle of democracy. It's where the old democracies, the US and the UK and maybe even France, these arose. And then the South, Asia, Africa, Latin America, these are the sites of the young democracies. That really post-World War II democracies, not Latin America, but certainly Asia and Africa. And also, along with this idea of young democracy, hand in hand, these are hard to separate, is also the idea of the wrong democracy. That the democracies of the West were founded in the right soil, were kind of, rooted in the right soil. And what you see in Asia and Africa is this valiant effort to transplant democracy in the wrong kind of soil. And I think that's always been used that's been used as an explanation for, or even to, even it's always been used as a way to even portray Indian democracy as somehow exceptional and somehow sort of, we see this against the odds, the miracle of Indian democracy. I think these are actually they're such pejorative claims, actually, against the odds, miracle, the idea that it's wrong to start with. And so when this idea of curative democracy came along, did it find fertile soil from the outset, fertile soil in the idea that, that India's democracy was always wrong? And I think this idea of a young democracy or a wrong democracy, it was often used as a kind of apology or an excuse. You would see this incredible violence in India's democracy, and people would say, yes, but it would have been, we're democratic despite the odds. Or, or sort of, patronage or clientelism. And, when I mean, not just the press, oh, that's my time, not just the press, but scholars would say too that that it's going to take time, that India's democracy is 50 years old or 70 years old compared to other democratic models which claim a history of 100, 200, 300 years. And so this question is curative democracy in some way the ability to use this concept of a diseased body politic, is that in some way related to the idea of the global South? Relatedly, when I think of the democracy, I think democracy itself has been sort of a very, in the way that we understand the history of democracy, including now the discussion about democratic backsliding, it is very much sort of tied to a Eurocentric or a West-centric discourse. And I thought, it is interesting. It's true. The idea of the broken democracy is familiar in India, or the young or the wrong democracy is familiar in India and has been for a long time. But my understanding of, say, the discourse around American democracy, the idea of the broken democracy rose up very quickly and sharply with Trump in the last two campaigns. But otherwise, there was a discourse of celebration. And there was, there is always the idea that there's room for improvement. Obama spoke about our quote unquote imperfect democracy. Biden used the same rhetoric, but the idea of imperfection implies a linear notion of progress. It's like modernization theory that, we're moving along. We sort of have so much worth celebrating. We've made great strides forward, and yes, there's room of improvement, but we're really good. That rhetoric or that discourse has not lent itself to the idea of curative democracy. It's lent itself to a notion of celebration. But that, the celebration has brought its own problems with it. And so the celebration of democracy in much of the US and Europe has therefore cloaked and excused and legitimized a massive amount of state violence. And in India, too, prior to the emergency, it's interesting with Nehru and this great faith in the state. From my reading of Nehru, the state and, democracy was important to, there was a disease in India's body politic, and that was the moral disease of communal violence. And people who operated according to religious categories, Nehru in the days of the partition speaks a great deal about the sickness of the soul that he sees particularly through communal violence, and the state, therefore, as the doctor to cure the sickness of the soul. And so given that rhetoric, curative democracy leads to one kind of violence and one kind of sort of populist sort of, maybe a diseased kind of politics, but a non-broken democracy, sort of a faith, sort of describing democracy as healthy and in need of preservation leads to a different kind of crisis and a different kind of violence, maybe in an older history. And so I'm also wondering, are both, again, sort of, if we think about the crises of the present, are there, does curative democracy one road to this crisis, but a healthy democracy or a perception of a healthy democracy may be a different road to a different crisis, but neither of them seems to me to be particularly positive. Because I think I'm almost out of time, I'll just say one final thing. Wait, actually, two final things. One is where does an exit from this kind of violence, which I see in both the celebration of democracy and the portrayal of democracy as sick, where does the exit come from? The book ends with this reference to the CAA protests, and I think a hint there that maybe where it comes from is letting go of the idea of purity or even any kind of homogeneous people, or even the idea of the people writ large as some kind of collective. Maybe it comes in fragmented, sort of small-scale, heterogeneous political action. But I also want to highlight one possibility that it comes from entirely within a bare bones definition of electoral democracy, from electoral politics. And one of the omissions in the book that I was quite struck by is Kanshiram. and the BSP, And so what you see in the BSP was not about the politics of protest. It was very much, it was sort of squarely, it worked squarely through electoral politics, through the ballot box, through kind of the manipulation of the ballot box, not necessarily pure political action, and the BSP and Kanchiram were criticized very much for that kind of transactional approach to electoral politics. But one could argue that one of the most fundamental revolutions in the hierarchies and the dysfunctions of Indian politics came about specifically through that completely electoral, kind of, you could say, transactional approach to the ballot box. And the comment I want to make, it's interesting, when we think about populist movements and this effort to cure democracy, so you have doctors all trying to cure democracy in multiple countries, but the solution in most cases is democracy itself. The goal is to repair democracy, at least in name only, not replace it. And so it's interesting, Trump's rejoinder, Trump's sort of diagnosis of all of the ills of democracy in the US is to sort of propose alternatives which he justifies using the rhetoric of democracy and equality. The same thing with Modi. Modi says over and over, Janta mera kavach hai, the people are my coat of armor, And so I was just struck by that. How come, to the extent that we have, I think beyond India, this idea of a diseased democracy that needs to be cured, why do you think the cure is also always presented in democratic terms? Why is the effort to repair democracy, you use that language of repair a lot in the book, why is the utopia a patched up democracy and not an alternative to it? I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for those comments. I've been furiously taking notes myself. Srirupa, do you want to respond while we gather some questions in the Q&A? And to our audience, please put your questions there, and we can turn to them once we hear from Srirupa.
Okay. Sure. Thank you. Thank you both so much. This is just so generous. I'm really overwhelmed by both your, incredibly generous and very, very productive reading. So thank you very much. And you know what, because there was so much overlap, which is wonderful, between what Ruchi had to say and what Kanchan said. And so what maybe I'll do, instead of responding individually to each of you, is pick up a couple of themes that I think run through both and address those, and then later on, I would love to continue this conversation and other fora. So I guess there were three things that I heard both of you say. One is this continuity question, right? I mean, that's the kind of simple way of glossing it, right? This question of, okay, what's new about this, and where and how does the emergency story, am I making too much of the emergency as this turning point where this curative democracy and outsider politics emerges, and isn't there a longer history to this, and don't we need to go back to a kind of not an emergency legacy, but a colonial legacy? And, we might even, if we at that level want to think about, the theme of political renunciation or this kind of distaste for politics, then we would, as many kind of people who work on Indian political thought have done, they've kind of gone back beyond even the colonial state itself to look at ideas about, Rajniti in India in a certain kind of way. So I guess what I would emphasize here is, yes, of course, there's this kind of longer historical repertoire. The ideas of a curative democracy and political outsider that emerge in the 70s are not new, but there is, perhaps what I find useful is to think of them in conjunctural ways. So what I think happens in the 1970s in particular, and is this, so what I didn't emphasize in my talk today, in my comments today, but is very much one of the arguments of the book, is that this emerges in the 70s out of both the authoritarian regime of the emergency and the post-emergency project of democratic restoration. So curative democracy and the political outsider and this idea of populism, the moral people needing redemption, is ironically both something the authoritarian Indira Gandhi regime embraces, right? In fact, the whole justification of the emergency is in the name of saving democracy. And, we have to kill democracy in order to save it, right? That's kind of the Indira Gandhi's logic. And then in the post-emergency period, very ironically, democratic restoration ends up reinforcing the very pillars of extra electoral authority that the emergency regime was all about. So both of these together end up creating this norm of extra electoral authority. And that, for me, is what is distinctive about the conjuncture of the 1970s, that this norm of extra electoral authority, that in that sense, I see it slightly differently than the kind of Gandhian call for renouncing politics and we continue to have that tradition of political abdication, right? As recently as Sonia Gandhi, refusing office, etc. We constantly have this kind of theater of political renunciation as a very important part of our political repertoire. But what happens in the 70s is this idea that we need these other actors, whether it's civil society or social movements or the media or the judiciary, later on ombuds authorities. We need this whole panoply of extra electoral institutions and actors. And these are the ones who are really going to be able to save the people, right? So that, in a sense, is why I think the emergency. But you're absolutely right that this is, it's important not to overstate the novelty of this moment and instead, emphasize the conjuncture and that this is a ratchet in the process. That's in relation to continuity, maybe what I would say as an initial response. And then the question, and this is, Ruchi, your very important point about, and I really like this idea of the post-colonial contemporary, or, the question of trying to look, think about the specificity of the global South. This is the kind of question of, the comparison question, or so what are the kind of broader, what are the broader stories, if any, that we can tell about populism or anything else for that matter from this very specific story that I've told in the book. And I think that it's actually really helpful to think about it, as you've both suggested in different ways, as to think about this variant of populism that I'm mapping through the Indian case in relation to this category of the kind of post-colony / global South version of populism. Because I think as an initial and immediate reaction, what you made me think about just while I was listening to you was the fact that in India, the backstory of populism and the backstory of curative democracy is a particular kind of developmental and developmentalist state, right? So we are not talking about a neoliberal democracy that then becomes populist, right? Which is the kind of standard story of the Atlantic Rim populisms, right? Where populism emerges in response to, if you're Danny Roderick, you would say hyperglobalization. If you were looking at all the various European examples, you would talk about populism emerging as a response to the technocracy of the European Union. But in the Indian case, ironically, it seems to be just the reverse, where the Aam Aadmi Party is in fact proposing a technocratic solution to the problem of, so in some ways it's almost the opposite of the kind of anti-technocratic turn of European populisms, right? And that really makes me then think, as you have suggested, Ruchi and Kanchan, that then we have to take seriously the post-colonial and the kind of developmental state and the kind of democracy and state society relations that the developmental state or the forms of sovereignty that you map, Ruchi, the violence, the pastoral power and sovereign violence configurations, and curative democracy as a as a response or as a not necessarily a reaction always, but as something that is molded by this particular kind of political and social field. So that becomes, I mean, that's a very, very useful way to kind of think about this. And then the other kind of comparative, the broader comparison or comparative lesson, I guess, what does the Indian case tell us about populism? I think for me, what was the big kind of revelation in terms of, what I felt the Indian case allowed me to think about that I hadn't thought about when I was reading the literature on populism was was I mean, very simply, the idea of democracy itself as the backstory of populism, that we have to root populism in ordinary politics, right? There's that this kind of idea of populism as a, monstrous aberration, Trump as the opposite of American democracy as we know it, Modi as the opposite of Indian democracy as we know it. And, variants of this in Germany, the elections have just concluded. And the idea is that the AfD is the opposite of everyone else on the German political spectrum. So these ideas of populism, authoritarian populism, the far right, as politics that we need to understand in isolation versus trying to kind of put them into the political repertoire of ordinary democracy. I guess that would be one of the maybe lessons. And then the second is the this and from it comes out particularly in the Indian context where the gap between political and social democracy is so vast, right? The fact that this is the Ambedkar point that we have not addressed, close to a century later, that there's this massive gap between political equality and social equality, that you have political equality in India and you do not have social equality. That has turned populism in the Indian context into a particular kind of politics of hierarchy, or a politics that reinforces hierarchy, right? And for me, then the broader lesson for that would be to ask the social question of the populist project, right? So it's not enough to just look at the populist logic of power to the people and evaluate that logic as a political logic. We also need to kind of look at the social and sociological aspects of this politics. I mean, whose politics is it? Who is able to be a curative Democrat, who is able to be a political outsider and not? And I'll just end with then this point, Kanchan, thank you for raising Kancham, and the question of electoral politics. And this, in a sense, is precisely, I think, where the anti-democratic and the exclusionary elements of Indian populism in this version of curative democracy really reveal themselves, which is this kind of distaste for electoral politics, this idea that, this is dirty business, this is, politics is impure, politics is corrupt, and, let's instead move to this kind of zone of clean moral interventions. Let's, look at the election commission. Let's look at, all other kinds of politics. And I think that is really, I mean, it's not a coincidence. And I'm, certainly this is not it's not an original point. Many people have pointed to, there's, kind of data for this, that this logic of anti-politics unfolds at precisely the time of the so-called plebeianization of our political representatives, right? So, whether you look at the kinds of data that Gilles Vernier and Christophe Jaffrelot have collected about the changing social and economic, the demographic profile of elected representatives, the transformations in assemblies and parliaments. And this has proceeded in tandem with the language of anti-politics, the two kind of feeding off each other. So you're absolutely right to point to the electoral domain as the kind of counter domain and the place of, the counter to curative democracy. So thank you for that. I'll stop here and then maybe come back to these in other points. Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the questions does ask again about the question of comparison. So, but first we have Tejaswini, who says, "Congratulations on the publication of the book. I can't wait to read it. I'd love to hear more about your point on television news and how you think it operated as a political actor." Oh, Shrirupa, you're yeah.
Yes. Do you want me to respond to the questions like one-on-one, or do you want to collect a couple and
It's up to you. We
Okay,
have two.
I'll respond. Thank you. Hi, Teja, and thank you. So yes, the how television news. So in the book I talk about the kind of media politics relationship at two levels. One is perhaps the more familiar level, which is the ways in which this kind of boom in the television news industry, um, contributed via, agenda setting or framing or priming. I mean, basically the media message itself. And this is the kind of textual analysis of the kinds of um, discourses, if you like, the kind of media narratives that were being produced by these channels really contributed to this kind of angry anti-politics of populism, right? So when I, talk about things like, the sting journalism, the hidden camera expose journalism, and the kind of high moral outrage, and kind of map that as one of the contributions to this, new politics. But then I also say that, this is the second level that I think it becomes very important, which is that it's not just at the level of discourse or agenda setting, but media institutions and journalists very literally played roles as political actors. They tried to intervene in very material and literal terms in politics. So, for instance, you have the term media crusade was an emic term that I encountered in the course of my interviews with people during my research on the media. People would talk about, journalists describe themselves as crusaders for the people, and they kind of would set aside this idea that media is only about reflecting and reporting objectively on politics, right? This kind of detached reflection, and would actively see themselves as needing to make a difference, needing to change things. And be a part of politics itself. So, everything from actually launching and running these public campaigns. There was this whole series of these justice for Jessica, justice for Priyadarshini. There was a whole series of campaigns with journalists and media organizations organized people on the streets, public petitions to get cases reopened, cases of, that had been allegedly mistried, where politically connected individuals had been let off for various crimes, right? So that was one way in which journalists tried to intervene. Quite a few journalists joined new political parties like the Aam Aadmi Party, right? And then, filing public interest litigation. So all of the ways in which really media saw themselves as political actors is what, I try to document in the book. So, yeah.
Thank you. Next is a question from Doug Haynes, who says hello. And he, just to paraphrase a little bit, he's asking about this point that Kanchan mentioned about the specificity of the emergency and the sort of general condition of the rise of populism. He says, India's specific explanations don't help us understand the commonalities, though they are necessary. And then he offers two sort of possibilities. One has to do with a shared expanding irrelevance of the animating ideologies that informed democracies in the post-1940s world, whether that's anti-colonialism or anti-communism. The other would be some kind of process involving imitation and interaction on a global level. For example, Trump clearly takes his inspiration from Hungary and even India. And Doug asks what your thoughts might be on this question of comparison.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Doug. Yes, absolutely. I'll begin with the second. And, the kind of networked global right is really, something quite fascinating, and also something that I think we need to, let practice actually influence our analysis of the right. I think a lot of the work, including on India and the rise of Hindutva, and other kind of countries, tends to be nationally focused, right? But at the same time, what you actually have, as you point out, is an incredible amount of real world networking across these various, movements. And that is absolutely the case. And I think we need to be able to also study that, like look at the global right as a actually networked formation. And this kind of imitation and interaction on a global level is definitely part of the case. And actually, it's not just the global right, the populism itself. In the book, I talk about how with the Aam Aadmi Party itself, there was a lot of, learning and borrowing from what they considered to be equivalent types of experiments in other parts of the world. There were quite a few other of these techno-populist parties at the time, and there was a conscious borrowing from that. So populism as a kind of networked phenomenon that needs to go beyond the rather nationalized frameworks with which we tend to approach populism is absolutely something to do. Um, Yes, also for the it's interesting that you talk about the shared expanding irrelevance of the post-19, these anti-communism and anti-colonialism in particular. And this gets back to Kanchan's question of what, the generative emergency. So one of the things that I note in the book is the ways in which, and I actually borrows from Samuel Moyne's work, of course, on another, in another context. He's talking about this in relation to the emergence of human rights and human rights norms in the 70s. And he's locating this as a response to what he calls the end of a particular kind of post-colonial utopia, right? So there's a kind of disenchantment with the post-colonial state in and through the 70s. And, he says human rights then becomes the utopia that the post-colonial state was, right? And I think at a domestic level, what you see in India through the 70s is precisely this kind of disenchantment with and disappointment with the anti-colonial / post-colonial promise. In the book, I talk about this as a shift from nation building, which has the kind of anti-colonial socialist registers of the 50s. So you go from nation building to democracy rebuilding. And, the kind of national project after the 70s becomes this project of democracy rebuilding, which is a different project. So you're right, absolutely, to point to the kind of changed norms, both nationally and globally, that contribute to this shift. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Kurt, we end at 1:30.
Okay.
So we're with a minute left, so I'll just take this opportunity to thank Srirupa for the book, and Kanchan and Ruchi for the incredibly generative and important comments. I'm sure there are many questions still lingering. I certainly have them, but I hope we can find another forum to discuss those. But yeah, thank you to you. Thank you to our guests. And please stay tuned for future events in our conversation series. Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Bye, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank
Navia,
you. Yeah.
Myrtle, we can end the recording now.
Bye, everybody. Thank
Yeah,
you
I'm
so
gonna do that
much.
right now.